Despite superficial similarities, it is obvious that state governments are not simply miniatures of the national government. This is especially true with respect to the executive branch. As we will discuss in the forthcoming lecture, unlike the U.S. Constitution, Missouri's Constitution specifically provides for the creation and empowerment of 16 different executive branch agencies. Moreover, and again, unlike the federal government, Missouri's Constitution provides for the popular election of 5 executive branch officers in addition to the governor. Historically, this puts Missouri in good company. During the first half of the 19th century, states dramatically expanded the range of executive offices subject to popular election. Over 2/3 of the states, like Missouri, elect secretaries of states, treasurers, auditors, and attorneys general. Some states took this expansion of popular control to an extreme with the election of surveyors, prison inspectors, and canal commissioners. As we saw with powers of the governor, the popular election of executive branch office holders effectively reduces the power of the General Assembly. With the election of judges, popular authority is vested not only in the legislature or people's branch, but in all branches of state government. Well, welcome back, everybody. John, it's good to see you back with us today. Hope you're feeling better. Last time we talked about the governor. Basically, we're talking about the executive branch, but we focused on the governor, the powers, the duties, the hats. I want to move on to talk about the other executive branch office holders and sort out how they're different than they are in the United States and how they're different from each other. So unless you have questions about the governor, I'd like to move on to the other executive branch office holders. All right? Basically, as we talked about in terms of a theme, going back to the Constitution, separation of powers, checks and balances, and democracy in terms of form of government. And I think it's important to remember how the executive branch office holders, the other office holders beside the governor, fit into that scheme of things. Basically, what we have is additional executive branch office holders. And they are the lieutenant governor. And we've talked a little bit about him in terms of the legislature. I want to focus a little bit more about the lieutenant governor. We have the auditor, somebody that we haven't talked about just yet. We also have the treasurer, the attorney general, and the Secretary of State. So Lieutenant Governor, Auditor, Treasurer, Attorney General, Secretary of State. Basically, what happens in Missouri, unlike the U.S., we talked about this before, when you elect the President of the United States, you elect the Vice President. But in Missouri, we elect the Lieutenant Governor separately from the Governor. But that is also true for the Auditor, for the Treasurer, for the Attorney General, for the Secretary of State. So if you think about separation of powers, instead of granting all executive power to one person, the governor, that executive power is divided up amongst the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, treasurer, auditor, attorney general, and secretary of state. So the power is divided, so we enhance separation of powers at the state level that we don't see at the national level. But this is also true as we get through this. This is also true for checks and balances. The mechanisms of checks and balances that are existing, we'll talk a little bit about this next time, but I want to introduce it here. The checks and balances that are in place in the executive branch of Missouri are much more robust than the checks and balances in place in the U.S. Constitution. Again, it's because the powers and duties of the departments and the executive branch office holders are here. But I also want to go back to that theme of democracy. We contrasted the U.S. Constitution in terms of a republic. We elect representatives with Missouri, where we have a republic and elected representatives, but we also have democracy, where you can take your clipboard, your petitions, and amend the Constitution and so on. And I think this aspect here of the Missouri Constitution is also democratic. You elect the lieutenant governor. You, the citizen of Missouri, elect the lieutenant governor. You elect the auditor, you elect the treasurer, you elect attorney general, secretary of state. You have the power over these executive branch office holders. And I think it's important to remember that, unlike the United States and unlike many other states, the citizen of Missouri, the average citizen of Missouri, has more control over his or her government. So that's how I would start. Basically, it's very straightforward in terms of the terms I want to go across, and it's simple. 4-year term, 4-year term, 4-year term, 4-year term, and, Carly? No, it's not 6 years. It's a 4-year term. Okay, so it's exactly the same, 4-year terms. Now, it is important to note which things are different. A couple of things. The auditor is elected in off-year or non-presidential elections. Non-P, I'm sorry. It's off-year, non-presidential elections. And what that basically means is 2014, 2018 instead of the regular presidential cycle. All the rest of these officers, lieutenant governor and so on, are on P, or on presidential elections. And so I'm just going to go across because, as we talked about earlier in the semester, it's important, it's easier to learn the material if you think about it horizontally instead of simply going up and down and memorizing. So lieutenant governor, it's 4 years on presidential election. The only one that's off presidential election years is the auditor. The third thing that I think is important is the qualifications. And you're going to be surprised by this. I think, in fact, I was surprised by this. And so this next line here, I want to put down the qualifications. And as you might imagine, the qualifications for the lieutenant governor are exactly the same as the governor. 30 years old, you have to be 30 years old, a resident of the United States for 15 years, and a resident of Missouri for 10 years. And so I'm going to abbreviate that with 30 years old, 15 years, 10 years. 30 years old, 15 years as a Missouri citizen, and, I'm sorry, 15 years as a U.S. citizen and 10 years as a Missouri citizen. All right, it's pretty straightforward. It's exactly the same with the governor. Now, interestingly, the qualifications for the auditor are different. The qualifications for the auditor informally or maybe politically over the last 15, 20, 25 years, there has been a movement to elect CPAs, certified public accountants. Now, this is not always true. Certainly, it's not every auditor has to be a CPA, but there has been an increasing concern that the auditor be a CPA. But it's important to note that this is an informal qualification. It is absolutely not a constitutional requirement. It's just something that is developed politically, and this is true for both candidates running as Democrats or candidates running as Republicans. But there are no formal, besides this is not a formal qualification, and the qualifications here are same as the governor. So the informal qualification seems to be CPA, but the same as the governor, which means the same as the lieutenant governor. 30 years old, 15 years resident of the United States, and 10-year resident of the state of Missouri. And so that is consistent. Now, when we get to the treasurer, a couple of things. The treasurer, unlike the governor, lieutenant governor, and auditor, has different qualifications. The qualifications for the treasurer are not specified with respect to age and residency and so on. Let me tell you what it says in particular in the Constitution. This is from Article 7, Section 8. An elected official in the state of Missouri, according to Article 7, Section 8, has to be a resident for 1 year. Yes, Joni, that's it. So the specificity that apply to the governor, lieutenant governor, and auditor do not apply to the treasurer. And so it's in some sense odd but in other ways it makes sense. Citizen legislatures, who should be qualified, opening up the process. There's a lot of variations on that. Now, there's less of a tradition with respect, the informal drive to get a CPA. That doesn't really apply with respect to the treasurer, and we can talk a little bit about that later if you want. But I want to go across on the qualifications. So the treasurer really doesn't have qualifications other than simple residency in the state of Missouri. The same is true for the Attorney General. The Attorney General's qualifications are exactly the same as the treasurer. Article 7, Section 8 must be a resident for 1 year in the state of Missouri. Now, like the auditor, there's an informal norm. And what do you think that informal norm for the Attorney General is? Carlos, if you're the Attorney General, you're going to be a lawyer. Thank you. That wasn't too hard. But and I'm going to get a lot of exercise today going back and forth, like the auditor, that it must be a lawyer is an informal rather than a formal qualification. I'm going to pause right here for something special. Ooh, it's an asterisk. The Attorney General is only mentioned in the Missouri Constitution with respect to qualifications, and that's only indirectly. The Attorney General is not a constitutionally specified office holder. In other words, the Attorney General is not here. The Attorney General's office was created by statute, not Constitution. And that is unique. It is different than the other executive branch office holders. The Attorney General was created by statute. We'll talk about the office here in just a little bit because I'll have to erase because I'm going to run out of room here. The Secretary of State has the exact same qualifications as the Treasurer Attorney General. Secretary of State qualifications are, again, Article 7, Section 8, must be a 1-year resident. So there's a lot of variation here in terms of the executive branch office holders and their qualifications. So what you see on this side of the board versus what you see on that side of the board, the off-year elections and so on. And there's one additional special characteristic, maybe more, but the treasurer gets an asterisk. The treasurer, like the governor, is limited to 2 terms. The other executive branch office holders, lieutenant governor, auditor, attorney general, secretary of state, are not limited to 2 terms. There is no limit to the number of terms. So the treasurer is limited to 2 terms like the governor is limited to 2 terms. And that would be the basic overview of the qualifications and so on of the executive branch office holders. Now, what I want to spend more time, really focus on our time, is what do these people actually do? What is their job? What is their office responsible for? So it's going to take erasing. So before I erase all that, John, did you have a question? Okay. So I'm going to erase this and we'll talk about exactly what the governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, and what these people actually do. Now, some of this is pretty straightforward, and I have more to say about some and less to say about others. But let's focus on the lieutenant governor. John Nance Garner, Vice President of the United States, when asked to describe the value of being Vice President of the United States, described it as akin to a warm bucket of spit. Basically, it's not worth very much. Similarly, the Lieutenant Governor of Missouri has been described as the state's spare tire. The state's spare tire, meaning something that you have just in case you need it, and you hope that it's in good shape when it's necessary. But let me go on a little bit in terms about what we mean by that. We talked about the legislature. We talked about the Senate. In particular, we talked about the presiding power of the lieutenant governor, and I want to revisit that for just a little bit. And specifically, we're talking about the presiding power in the Senate. The Constitution says that the lieutenant governor is the presiding officer, but as I said, in practice, it's the president pro tem that is in charge of the Senate, is actually the presiding officer. And I wanted to spend just a little bit of time on that. I mean, basically what it comes down to is the lieutenant governor's formal role as defined by Constitution is limited to voting in breaking of a tie. When it really comes down to it, the only power that the lieutenant governor has in the Senate is to vote in break of a tie. Now, I want to go back a little bit in terms of history. 1973, State versus Kaysen. Missouri State Supreme Court rules that the Senate doesn't have to give procedural power to the lieutenant governor. So, he gets to vote in the case of a tie, but that's it. Well, what about taking over in place of the governor? And this has been another constitutional issue that has been resolved by the Missouri State Supreme Court. The Constitution specifies that when the governor is absent, the lieutenant governor is in charge of the state of Missouri. Well, what does absent mean? Now, way back when, before you were born, California had some issues with Republican governor and Democratic lieutenant governor, much as we've had in Missouri. The governor would leave and the lieutenant governor would actually do things. Well, Missouri State Supreme Court has resolved this issue as well by defining two types of absence. One is physical absence, and the other is effective absence. Physical absence as distinguished from effective absence. Now, physical absence, I think we know what that means. I'm in Missouri. Can you follow me all the way over? Keep following, keep following. I'm not in Missouri anymore. I am physically absent from the state. Now, does that mean I can't do my job as governor? Well, ultimately, this came to a court challenge. Much like everything else in America, somebody has to sue somebody in order to make a ruling. And the Missouri State Supreme Court ruled in the case of Ashcroft versus Blunt, 1991. John Ashcroft was the governor. Now Senator Roy Blunt was Secretary of State. Governor Ashcroft was physically absent from the state. He signed documents and sent them via fax. Yeah, old school. Sent the fax. The Secretary of State, who we'll talk about in just a minute, did not recognize the facsimile signature as legitimate authority. So Governor Ashcroft and Secretary of State Blunt disagreed on whether the governor could perform his duties while physically absent. The Supreme Court sided with Governor Ashcroft that because he was physically absent did not mean that he was not effectively absent, that he could not discharge the duties of his office, that a faxed signature was legitimate. So the governor is physically absent. That doesn't mean he's not the governor and has all of the powers and duties that go with that. Now, as you would imagine, this is 1991, and we're arguing over whether a fax is a legitimate signature. What do we have now? We've got Skype. We've got YouTube. We've got cell phones. It's very difficult for a governor to be effectively absent. And so I think this rule from 1991 basically nullifies the role of lieutenant governor in terms of the absence of the governor himself. So, constitutionally, the presiding officer? Well, not really. Constitutionally, is in charge of the state when the governor is absent? Well, again, not really. So what does the lieutenant governor do? Well, in 1992, the voters of Missouri gave the lieutenant governor something else to take care of. There was a referendum passed in Missouri. We'll talk about the referendum process a little bit later. And, Missouri passed a referendum that created the Office of Advocacy and Assistance. Say that 10 times fast. Office of Advocacy and Assistance for the Elderly. and put that office under the control of the lieutenant governor. So the voters of Missouri created the Office of Advocacy and Assistance for the Elderly and put that under the charge of the lieutenant governor. So what does that mean? The lieutenant governor is in effect a statewide advocate for the elderly. And that means elder abuse, regulations with respect to nursing homes, hospital, medical care, and so on. There's a plethora of things that fall under that category. Now, there's not a lot of teeth in terms of enforcement, but this office is part of the regular official formal duties, not constitutional, but passed by the Missouri citizens as part of the official duties of the lieutenant governor. So there is a role there. We'll come back to talk about the lieutenant governor in a bit, in just a second. So questions about the powers of lieutenant governor? Constitutionally, yes, but in reality, ultimately, the answer is no. And that may have some bearing on what we're going to talk about in just a second. Now, moving on to the auditor, what does the auditor actually do? The auditor oversees state expenditures. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Oversees state expenditures and determines whether state funds are being spent properly. I mean, I think the key terms are overseeing state funds and spent properly. How do I know that the state funds are being spent properly? Well, the auditor conducts. Carly, what does the auditor conduct? No, it's not the St. Louis Symphony, but thank you for that. And I hope everyone in our TV audience appreciates Carly's sense of humor. The auditor conducts audits. The auditor is responsible for conducting audits of every state agency, and we're going to talk about those a little bit next time. The auditor conducts audits of every state agency and the state treasury. So audits of agencies and departments, and also the treasury as a whole. Now, we'll talk about how the auditor is different from the treasurer in just a second, but basically being sure that the money is spent appropriately, correctly, within statute. Now, it is also possible that you have seen the auditor in your local constituency, your town, your county, your school district, because again, that democratic theme rears its head. You have the power to take your clipboard, get enough signatures on a petition to bring the auditor to audit the books, basically audit the books of, say, the city of Springfield or Greene County or the Springfield School Board, R12, or any other local municipality, anybody with a budget. Again, remember we talked about Missouri having a unitary form of government. All power is in Jefferson City. You as a citizen have the power to call in the state auditor to audit the books of your municipality or your local government. And so the auditor has an interesting position with respect to the press. An auditor comes in and audits the books and says everything's good. The auditor gets good press. The auditor comes in and says the books are messed up. The auditor gets good press for pointing out the deficiencies and the problems. And again, we'll talk about how that role can translate into something else in just a second. Now, the treasurer is different than the auditor, and this is important. The treasurer, for lack of a better term, is the custodian of state funds, is basically the state's banker. If I had to give you an English term, it would be the banker. Basically, what the treasurer does is the treasurer is responsible for depositing, monitoring, and investing state money. Deposit, monitor, and invest. The state's banker. Basically, we have a balanced budget amendment and so on. The treasurer is responsible for making sure that we have all the money in the accounts that we're supposed to and investing some of that money in order for the state to make money, just like you would with your bank and so on. Now, this office, the Office of the Treasurer, as well as the Secretary of State, we'll talk about this in a little bit, has become a bit more political. And I want to tell you give you one example of a political role that doesn't seem to be defined in this role of banker. And this is during the term of Sarah Steelman. Sarah Steelman was the treasurer, and during her time, she began a review of state investments. She took where is all Missouri's money being invested in, and she reviewed all that in order to screen for, in order to screen for and divest, take Missouri's money out, if possible, screen for and divest from companies, investment companies and so on, that were associated with governments that had been sanctioned by the United States for supporting terrorism. What Sarah Steelman was after, and this was the term that was coined basically, terror-free investments. Sarah Steelman went through all of the state's investment and was basically trying to target any company that had investment ties to Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria. That was the list at the time. So anybody that was sanctioned by the United States government for sponsoring terrorism or aiding terrorism, we didn't want to have anything to do with them. And so Sarah Steelman, that was one of her focus points in her time as treasurer of the state of Missouri. Also, it was a focus point for her in her relation to other state treasurers. And so what Sarah Steelman did here in Missouri was then copied by other state treasurers at the impotence of Sarah Steelman. So it's not just, this position has evolved. Yes, it's the custodian, it's the banker, it's the investment, and so on, but it became more certainly during the term or tenure of Sarah Steelman as treasurer. Paul? Honestly, I don't know how many other states adopted this, but there was a letter to the editor, I believe it was in the New York Times, that Sarah Steelman wrote at the time as an effort to get the other states to do that. I'm only the Missouri government guy. Okay, I'm sorry, I just don't know, I don't know the answer. And it's one other, this probably is the most interesting thing recently, but it's important to note also that the treasurer serves, and this is important to me, the treasurer serves on the board of the Missouri State Employees Retirement System, which we call MOSERS, Missouri State Employees Retirement System. State employees get a pension, and the treasurer is on the board that oversees the investment of state money to provide for that pension. The treasurer also serves on the Housing Development Commission. This has a greater impact in the urban areas, but it's an important role in terms of how the state invests money. Remember, second lecture, in 1850 the state went bankrupt. Okay? The treasurer is there to be sure that the state doesn't go bankrupt again. All right, moving on to the Attorney General. As we said, the Attorney General is not actually in the Constitution. That office was created by statute. I think it's important to note that there's really two parts here. The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the state of Missouri, the chief law enforcement officer of the entire state. When we talk about law enforcement, we tend to think about cops and robbers, but the Attorney General's office is actually divided into separate divisions. Not all of them are related to cops and robbers or criminal things. So let me just give you the list. It'd be litigation. There's a litigation office. There's a trade enforcement office. I'm running out of space. Litigation, trade enforcement, criminal division, governmental affairs division. So criminal is the cops and robbers. Litigation, trade enforcement, criminal, governmental affairs, and I know there's one more and I can't remember what it is. Oh, I'm sorry, human and environmental resources. So as the chief law enforcement officer, the Attorney General is responsible for an enormous array of legal issues that face the state of Missouri, both as a state and you as citizens. So the Attorney General is your chief law enforcement officer, but it's more than that. The Attorney General also represents the legal interests of the state. The Attorney General is the legal representative of the state of Missouri, and that means when the state of Missouri is challenged in court or when the state of Missouri is challenging something else in court, and this goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. When a Missouri statute is challenged and someone has to represent the state of Missouri before the United States Supreme Court, that somebody is the Attorney General. Questions? Okay, moving on to the Secretary of State. Secretary of State is responsible, this is boring and interesting at the same time. I know that's an oxymoron. The Secretary of State is responsible for collecting, compiling, and publishing state documents. And I'll explain the publishing here in just a second. Collecting, compiling, and publishing state documents. I think the first role that we see with respect to Secretary of State is this one. Now, best example, this right here. Constitution of the State of Missouri, and underneath my fingers it says who the Secretary of State is. Every Secretary of State is responsible for publishing the Constitution and making it available to the citizens. Every Secretary of State is responsible for adding the amendments and so on, and that's the job, is this one here. What most people remember or know about the Secretary of State is this. Carlos, what do you think we call this book? No, it is not the big book. It is the blue book. Why do we call it the blue book? Because it's blue, except for the one time when it was mauve. The blue book was actually mauve, but that's a whole other story we don't have time for today. This is the blue book. What's in the blue book? Well, I'll just throw it open here. Hey, it's the executive department, and it talks about self-insurance in section 287. And look, here are pictures of all the officers who serve this aspect of the bureaucracy. Everything in here, anything you could possibly imagine about the state of Missouri, its policies, its procedures, its officers, is in the blue book. This is something that you will see in Antiques Roadshow. This is the last blue book. This was the last blue book that was published. This is going to be a rare commodity. Okay, there were hundreds of thousands of them printed, but the state of Missouri, in an effort to save money, is no longer publishing the state blue book. This is all migrated online, but it is still the responsibility of the Secretary of State's office to be sure that this material is then published. And so the first duty is collecting, compiling, and publishing. Probably a more important duty of the Secretary of State is the chief election officer. I mean, when you stay up night trying to figure out who's going to win the election, ultimately the person who certifies the winners and losers is the Secretary of State. More recently, it's another aspect of their role is with respect to the initiative and referendum process. Initiatives, we'll talk about again later, we talked a little bit about before. You take your clipboard, you get signatures and so on and so forth. It's the Secretary of State's office that verifies that these signatures are legitimate and that you have enough of them. So if you want to challenge something, if you want to put something on the ballot, if you want to change the Constitution, you got to get the signatures. Ultimately, it's the Secretary of State's office that certifies that you have the legitimate number and type of signatures. Again, we won't go into the details of numbers and percentages. Perhaps even more important than that, if you get on the ballot, the Secretary of State's office is responsible for what's called the ballot summary. Many of the initiative referendum petitions are lengthy, not stuff that's going to fit on a ballot. Somebody has to give you the Cliff Note or Spark Note version of the initiative referendum so that when you go in to vote, you know what you're voting on. Well, unfortunately, this has been one of the most controversial aspects of the Secretary of State's job. And we don't have to go back very far to see where this comes into play. Two examples would be in 2008, and some of you might remember 2010. 2008 was the statewide initiative over stem cell research, and 2010 was the referendum on what was called puppy mills. Enough signatures turned in, goes to the Secretary of State's office. Secretary of State, now not the Secretary of State themselves, but the Secretary of State's office wrote ballot language for stem cell research, wrote ballot language for puppy mills. Almost immediately, courts started in action, lawsuits start, and the ballot language, it becomes a legal question. That's not right. That's making a case for one side versus the other side. So the Secretary of State's office is the focal point of legal action in the initiative and referendum process over this issue of ballot language. And it is true that we see this more recently, more in the 2000s than we have. It's an increasingly likely legal challenge over ballot language. I think it's a fair statement to say. But it is not completely recent. We can go back when we talked a minute ago, Secretary of State was Roy Blunt. We saw legal challenges even into the early 90s. And so this is a phenomenon that has been going on for a while, but I think it's on one of those curves that's going up pretty dramatically. The more we use initiatives and referendums, the more likely it is for that challenge to go to the Secretary of State's office. And so I think it is historically it's always been there, but it's on the rise, and I think you'll see that more often. All right, that is essentially the offices themselves, but I want to step back. I want to step back and erase again and look at these offices and give you a little bit of history. Do 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 do. Oh, I'm sorry, was I humming? All right, a little bit of history. Anybody know what Bonneville Salt Flats is? John knows what Bonneville Salt Flats. It's a salt flat, and what do we do there, John? We race cars. I want you to think about these executive branch office holders as the proving ground. Much like we use the Bonneville Salt Flats to test engines and motors and see how fast we can go, these executive branch office holders have become proving grounds for someone to be the governor of the state of Missouri. And I want to talk just a little bit about that in terms of, we'll start with your lifetime. Governors in your lifetime. Governor Nixon was the Attorney General before he became governor. Governor Blunt was the Secretary of State. Governor Holden was the Treasurer. Governor Carnahan was also the Treasurer. And Governor Ashcroft, who we talked about it a minute ago, was the Attorney General before he was elected governor. Now, if we want to go back to governors in my lifetime, as opposed to yours, Governor Bond, Kit Bond was the auditor before he was governor. Governor Hearns was the Secretary of State before he was governor. And Governor Dalton was the Attorney General. So in our collective lifetime, most of the governors have come from these other executive branch office holders. Only James Blair, 1957, he was the only lieutenant governor that was elected governor. Now, when Governor Carnahan passed away in the plane crash, Lieutenant Governor Wilson took over, but he was not elected. So Blair was the only lieutenant governor elected. And only Joe Teasdale in 1976, he was the only governor in our collective lifetimes that was not one of these executive branch office holders. Even if you count Lieutenant Governor Wilson and Lieutenant Governor Blair, Teasdale is the only one in 1976 who didn't prove themselves first in a statewide election here. And each one of these offices is represented in that group. Somebody was auditor, somebody was treasurer, somebody was attorney general, somebody was a secretary of state. So if you want to be the governor of Missouri, you want to get that statewide election here first. Now, This provides a certain amount of tension within the executive branch. You know, again, if it was the president appoints the Secretary of State with advice and consent of the Senate and so on and so forth, but it allows the governor, or excuse me, the president to have a little bit more control. But as we said a minute ago, you have the control over who's going to be the executive branch office holders, and that creates some tension. And I think most of you will remember what we saw with Governor Nixon and Lieutenant Governor Kinder. I mean, we have the governor and lieutenant governor, two opposite parties, both running for the same office, and that creates tension. We saw that very same tension with Governor Blunt, Republican, and Attorney General, then Attorney General Nixon, the Democrat, who was going to run. Now, ultimately, Governor Blunt didn't run for re-election, but there was a great deal of tension between Attorney General Nixon's office and Governor Blunt's office. And lest ye think, we want to say that 10 times, lest ye think that this is a Democrat versus Republican thing. That's not true, because during Governor Holden's first term, he was challenged and defeated by the then auditor, who was Claire McCaskill. So it's not a Democratic or Republican thing. It creates tension. If this is the proving ground to get elected to be governor, well, then you're going to have tension between the officers in the executive branch, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. Now, some people have argued that while this is more democratic, allowing you to have control, the direct election of these executive branch office holders probably makes Missouri's government more political and maybe just a little bit less efficient. But that's something for the voters to decide. This is what we have, this is what you like, because it gives you the control. Then you have to be willing to deal with some of the politicization of the executive branch. Okay? All right, that's it for the other elected office holders. Next time, I want to talk about the actual agencies and departments and how they're run. Thanks very much for your time today.